Hey, good morning. It's great to see you. So there's this, we're in this series about character, and I was reminded here a few weeks ago, a friend of mine coaches the reps for the Legion programs, so that make him like the JV coach. And early on in the winter workout stuff, he had shared that they were short of arms to throw BP on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So I was like, I'll come throw. That's one of the things that I can do. And so I've been throwing there on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and there's this one kid, well, there's lots of kids, but one week what we were working on was, what's the pitch you can't hit? And there's this one kid he's a super sweet kid, big kid, funny kid, better pitcher than hitter, which makes sense because, hitting a baseball is the hardest feat in sports, in my opinion. And so he got in the cage, and I was like, okay, so what's the pitch you can't hit? And he goes, inside. And he goes, or outside. And I said, so basically, if I throw the ball down the middle, you're trouble, but otherwise, I can get you out. And he said, yeah, pretty much. It was the best. But I think humility or self-awareness is a moral trait, isn't it? So if you weren't with us last week, we started this series where we're just trying to draw attention to moral character. And for me, the jumping off point was, I think for all of us, part of what COVID did is it reminded us how fragile life is. I had a good friend say on Friday, he said, life is just a series of life is just a series of uncontrollable events. It's like, yeah, and if I could just live in that. But I feel like that's what COVID's kind of brought to the surface, especially for people like me who, quite frankly, haven't really suffered in life, and probably many people from my age and younger, we just haven't experienced the types of things others of you have, that there was this fragility that came to the surface, this reminder that even things as otherwise trivial as our recreation, not to mention school and work and the ability to go out to eat, and then there became this whole kind of social code around how you can and can't and should and shouldn't socialize, and trying to figure out who is on this page and who is on that page. And it just, for me, was this glaring reminder that we don't have control of very much. But as much as I agree with my friend, it seems like one of the things that we do have control over to some extent is who we are and how we show up. I was thinking even this week, like that message is so clear in the text that what we get from life is who we become, what God gets from our life, what our friends, what our family get from our life is who we become. And even see, I think, tastes of this with guys like Paul when he's saying things, oftentimes in a social context in the New Testament that's not, it's not achieved the level of justice that we would want, like say when he's speaking to slaves. And yet even there, he tends to say things like, hey, no matter what your situation in life, just remember, you have control over your character, which can be wildly offensive to us. And I don't think in any way is it suggesting that God is insensitive to those social issues, but at the same time, even in the worst possible circumstances, there seems to be this refrain that what you get out of life is who you become. And this reminder that while many would say that the Christian worldview is very dated, maybe COVID's exposing the reality that like the Christian message is not that this life doesn't mean anything, so live it however you want, that the Christian message is like the point of this life is the development of character, no matter what your situation. So last week we just wanted to create a context as we head for Easter around this. Like, where are the opportunities for growth for you and for me in this season? We talked last week, just one more quick review, because I think this, for me, this creates language that I find so useful, this idea of Adam 1 versus Adam 2. And we said last week that this originated from a 20th century rabbi who somewhere around the 1950s observed that in Genesis 1, you have one kind of a human, and in Genesis 2, you have another. Or you might say in Genesis 1, you have one kind of an Adam, one kind of an approach to life, and in Genesis 2, another. And the Adam 1, or the Genesis 1, is an Adam who's very focused on creation and discovery, who's really focused on getting things done. You might call it the ego Adam. But then in Genesis 2, you have this different kind of Adam, and that Adam is much more focused on moral character, less individualistic, more focused on community, less focused on accomplishment, more focused on service. And what I love about his work, this to me is the gold, is in no way is he suggesting that one is morally superior to the other. He says that what we're getting is not a picture that would say Adam 1 is good and Adam 2 is bad, or Adam 2 is good and Adam 1's bad, but that in the text, in the story, to be human is to manage the tension between these two things. And many of you feel that every day. You're trying to make a team, but you're also trying to do it honestly. You're trying to raise a family, but you're also trying to pay a mortgage. You're trying to accomplish a goal, but you're trying to do so in a way that honors Christ. I mean, there's this tension. I was reminded of a mentor of mine early on. He said to me, Adam, I hope when you get to hell, I hope if you have to choose between being a A+ communicator and a C+ father and husband, or a C+ communicator and an A+ father and husband, I hope you'll choose the dad-husband part. And I've kind of carried that, and I think I see where he's coming from, but Adam 1, Adam 2 has created language for me to go, like, I think I would push back on that today. Not that, there's this argument around importance, and I suppose if we really nuance that, we would have to give one more weight than the other, but the way I think about it is this, man, if someone like Peyton Manning, if he can work so hard on his craft and be so dedicated to his Adam 1, but at the same time, as best I can tell, he's a pretty remarkable human, then wouldn't we have the same responsibility, whether we're teachers, educators, nurses, stay-at-home parents, whatever it is, to manage the 1 and the 2? So what we talked about last week is to grow your Adam 1 is somewhat simple. You focus on your strengths. But what we're leaning into here is how do you grow your Adam 2? And we explored last week, you grow your Adam 2 by first of all, becoming aware of your weaknesses. I can't hit inside pitches or outside pitches, so where do I start? Last week that was the closing question was, so what's your chief moral vice? What's your thematic sin? And maybe that's uncomfortable language, but to me where it's empowering is it may lead you to the realization that you don't have 50, but you have like 1 or 2. We talk about keystone habits, that if we can get these couple things right, then a whole series of things follows. For some of you, if you get your workout in the morning, like life just happens better after that. Seems like Jesus offers some hint that sin works in similar ways. Even in the wilderness, it seems like it's a story about evil can expose a couple aspects of him. But if he deals with those, then the rest of it will kind of fall in alignment. And so we asked this question, what is yours? I talked last week, I think mine has to do with cowardice and courage. I talked to a friend who his has to do with his issues of abandonment. And when he gets out of line, when he makes bad choices, when he betrays his own values, it's almost always that trigger. I've also talked to people who couldn't figure theirs out, and you're wrestling with it. And so I applaud that, and I think this morning I want to help you with that, because there's another way to go about that. Soren Kierkegaard said that if you want to figure out what you're put on earth for, David Brooks tells this story in Second Mountain, that one of the things you can do is you look into your past, you identify the moments in your life where you felt most alive, and then you see if you can draw a line through them, see if you can find the theme. Well, that's a very Adam 1 kind of approach, and I think makes sense. But I think we can invert that too and say it works the same way with Adam 2. What happens if you look in your past and see the areas where you've caused the most pain, see the areas where you've made your stupidest choices, see the areas that you're most ashamed of or embarrassed by, your greatest sin. And again, see if there's a line that you can draw. See if there's a theme. And this morning, the one I want to look at, have you ever pulled the plug on something? Like, maybe it's the proverbial wedding. You don't have to raise your hand if you pulled the plug on one of those at the last second. Or have you ever written a paper and spent a lot of time on it, and then you got to the finish line, it was time to hand it in, and you're like, I don't buy it. Ever done that to yourself? It's a terrible, terrible feeling. That's what happened to me the first part of last week. Having worked on this series, thought about this stuff, I think it kind of coalesced with some of the stuff that COVID's doing in me, which we're going to talk about in a couple weeks, I think. With this realization of I don't buy any of this. And that's where I want to explore this morning. See, what struck me was I think about moral character, and so maybe this will be helpful to you if you can't think of yours. I'm realizing I think about it in very individualistic terms. My purpose for focusing on moral character is so that I can look in the mirror and feel good about myself, so that I can think of God and know that God thinks well of me. But what if that's a very Western way to think about moral character, and in doing, what if it's very different than the way Jesus thinks about it? Let me just jump into this and see if I can. We're going to work through Matthew 5, which is what is often called the Sermon on the Mount. And I guess the question that I want to ask here is, what if Jesus calls us to develop our moral character in community, with community, but really for community? And what if there's a danger to thinking about your moral character or your son or daughter's moral character for them? And what if there's a danger to missing the fact that it's kind of not for them, it's for us? And what if part of what COVID's inviting us as a culture is to recognize that individualism, it has some gifts to it? I think the pendulum has swung that way in ways that we benefit, but maybe also there's some unhealth to it where we would do well to lean into Jesus' way of seeing the world a little bit more. Let's just look at Matthew 5. So I've kind of already told you, here's the filter, and I guess you get to decide whether or not you agree. I'm going to start in Matthew 5:21, and I'm going to read a chunk here. You've heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you're angry with a brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you'll be liable to the hell of fire. So when you're offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you'll be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you'll never get out until you've paid the last penny. Question: was Jesus interested in our Adam 2 selves? Was Jesus a moral teacher? See, and I think this is important because left to ourselves, I think culturally there's this tendency to just see him as a religious leader. Dallas Willard, as best I can tell, one of my favorite thinkers, spent the last part of his life emphasizing that we've neglected Jesus as the genius that he was and see him just as a religious savior. In fact, he gives the example, if you were to ask most any American, who's the smartest person or who are the smartest people to live, you're likely to hear Einstein. There's any host of other people you may hear, men and women. But he points out, even among Christians, you may never hear the name Jesus. And his concern was, we're so taking for granted his keen intellect and his moral genius that we're completely missing it. But notice here, Jesus is talking about some radical ideas. He's going, is murder really the problem? Could it be that anger and contempt are actually the problem? He keeps going. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Now let's just name the distraction. For some of you, hell is a distracting concept, and I don't think it's essential that we all agree on what is going on here with hell. There's options. One of them is that when Jesus speaks of hell, that he has in mind what traditional Western Christianity has had in mind, and that is this idea that there's a place where people who reject God spend the rest of eternity suffering. It's possible that's what he's referring to. It's also possible he's referring to something that is more along the lines of annihilationism, that hell has more to do with this idea that you can miss out on life, and in doing, at the end of your life, you just cease to exist. It's possible. It's also possible that we nuance hell even further. You know, the word hell actually only shows up in the Bible 12 times. It never shows up in the Old Testament, and 11 of the 12 come from the mouth of Jesus. The word is Gehenna, and some of you may be nuanced around this idea. Gehenna was the transfer station. It was the garbage dump. But much more like, say, a place like Rio de Janeiro, it wasn't just a garbage dump, it was where the most impoverished people lived. So you may go like, hell's none of those things, it's this other concept that we have to do more historical work on. My point would be this: is Jesus suggesting that it's possible to suffer total loss at the end of your life? That, to me, we should all be able to agree on. That he's suggesting it's possible to live your life and at the end of your life to have completely neglected what was important to the extent that you lose everything. But then we get to this, I think, other question, and maybe more important question. How far does a person's morality extend? Is adultery primarily about you and your eternal destination, or is it about the ripple effects caused? Let's keep going. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Just thought, let's just handle all the controversial passages in one Sunday. Then next week we'll talk about the Bible, and the week after that, COVID, and it's just going to be a hoot. There's two schools of thought. Again, let's just deal with the distraction. My primary point isn't divorce, but I think we got to deal with this to move forward into what I think Jesus is really getting at here. In Jesus' day, there were two schools of thought, as far as I understand, about divorce. One was a school of thought that was what you might call more traditional, that said that a husband, his wife was property, and therefore he could get a divorce under any grounds. If she burns the toast, is often the example, he could get a divorce, and really all he had to do was kick her out. There was another school of thought that said, no, women have more dignity than that. And maybe they hadn't achieved the level that we would celebrate today, but there was still this other view that was starting to wrestle with the fact, like, wait a minute, that leaves women in a horrible situation. Maybe there needs to be a more dignified process, and maybe there actually needs to be some limitations to what actually can kick that process into gear. So you can see, like what we hear here is like, divorce is always the wrong thing. It's not actually what Jesus is saying. He's really talking about a morality that what? That is more than just concerned with your ability to serve communion on Sunday. That it's more concerned with just your ability to look in the mirror. It's a morality that extends beyond the self. Let's go one more. Again, you've heard that it was said to those in ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. N.T. Wright, in dealing with this passage and others like it, he reminds that what we're getting at here is the conflict between what you might call Aristotelian morality, that Greece gave us, and we have lots of things that we're indebted to Western Greek culture for. Part of what they gave us was guys like Aristotle, they saw morality as an individual issue. And this pushes up against the way Jesus sees the world. That Jesus wasn't a Westerner, he wasn't Greek. He was an Eastern thinker in those standards. He was Jewish. And his view wasn't as individualistic as ours, and his view of morality tended to go with the idea that morality is a team sport, that it's ultimately not just about you. There's this vivid picture of this in Israel that I experienced years ago, where there was an older woman, and now I can't say what age I think she was because it's a trap. Let's just say she was an older woman, and she was repairing the terrace wall of her garden. And if you're not familiar with the landscape, I probably should have thrown a picture up there, but especially in Jesus' day, you would make your living, and you weren't selling anything, your family would survive off of your plot of ground. But that's great if you live on a plain where you have a nice field. What happens if you live in a mountainous or what we would call a hilly region, say something like what we have around here? Well, then they would build these, what we would call a retaining wall. So essentially you have a hillside, they would build a retaining wall out of individual rock and mortar, and then they would fill in the difference. And above you would be another family, and they had theirs. So you'd have these terraced hills, almost pyramid-like. Well, there was a woman who had her pail of rocks and her pail of grout substance stuff, and she was standing below her terrace wall, and she was clearly repairing this wall. She was adding rock, she was adding grout or mortar or whatever that would be. And the observation that a guy named Ray Vanderland made was if you stop and think about it, she doesn't need to repair that wall. That in her lifetime, the wall is going to be secure enough. It's not going anywhere. And probably her kids are going to be fine if nobody ever tends to the wall for the next several decades. But it speaks to the worldview difference. This woman is doing this knowing that she's tending to a wall for people she'll likely never meet. For her grandkids, but more so her great-grandkids and her great-great-grandkids. It speaks to this moral lens that goes, wait a minute. Adultery, divorce, lying, bad oath-taking, anger, contempt. It's not just about you. This winter, my running route this winter, because now we have a dog, so I'm doing less trail and more just running from my house. And so my route this winter is we live on Warren. I run down Warren towards Kendrick Legion Field, cross Helena, jump on Centennial Trail, run back there by the concrete place, turn around and come back, and it's just a 3-mile little deal. But my dog Yachty, it keeps him from climbing the walls while the rest of us are at work. And so this time of year, really in the winter, it's dark, there's nobody out, so I don't even put a leash on him. He's well trained. He has an e-collar or a shock collar, which basically means all we gotta do is hit the audible button and he's kind of back on your hip. And so I'll run down the street with him, hold his collar across the street, and then when we get over to Kendrick, let him go again. But the highlight of his life is the rabbits that live in the park around the little bathroom thing. And then if you can picture, there's that Northwestern Energy storage lot, and there's a bunch of rabbits behind Kendrick there, and that's his highlight. So I always know he runs ahead there, I let him, whatever, and then we run the trails, and he gets boring through Centennial Park, and then we turn around and come back, and then he gets all excited. Well, several months ago, it may have even been before Christmas, we were coming back, and as I come through the tunnel, oftentimes he'll get way ahead, especially if he gets on a rabbit and he runs ahead, and I don't sweat it, because again, I can just hit the button and he's right there, and there's nobody out that he can really have a negative impact on. Well, this time, he got way out in front of me, and he was kind of passing the bathroom, and I was just getting to the street, and there's that warming hut for the ice skating thing, and I could kind of see him there, but I hadn't even made that turn yet, and so I beeped him, and it sure felt like he just got faster. And so I beeped him again, and he was gone. So then I'm like laying on the shock thing, which I try not to do, and just laying on that thing, and he's nowhere to be seen. So I become the undignified guy sprinting down the sidewalk, which isn't a pretty scene. And I got up, there's the I don't know if you can picture, there's a big tall house, there's a daycare there, kind of on a side street next to Helena Avenue, and then there's the sewing place. And as I got close to that daycare, there was a guy who had obviously just dropped his kids off, and as he was getting in his car, he's like, "Hey, are you looking for a black dog?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "I just saw him just dart across Helena Avenue." So perfect, it's like 7:45 in the morning, he's playing Frogger on Helena Avenue. So, what do you do? So I cross the street, I'm running up the next block, and we just live up that way, and now I can't decide, do I hit the beeper, do I not? Because I don't even know what side of the street he's on, and so I didn't really know what to do, and then I came upon this guy that I see every morning, this neat hippie guy who walks, he's like the most walked dog in town. I see him in the morning, I see him at lunch, I see him after work, and I said, "Hey, did you see my dog?" And he's like, "Yeah, I just saw him sprinting up the block." So he was like Forrest Gump. I think he must have been headed for our house. So as I'm standing there, my mom lives over here, so I thought maybe he would have gone to her house, kind of on this one corner. And as I'm trying to figure all that out, he just appeared, looking like a dog, like, "Hey, how's it going?" Here's what I think happened, and I of course don't know. I think what happened was in his dogness and rabbitness, I think he forgot that he was in front of me, not behind me. And so when I started beeping him, he was like returning to sender, but the only thing that can make sense to me is he thought I was out in front of him, not behind him, and so he was trying to catch me. Apparently he thinks more about my speed than he ought to, and so he was just going for it. I think what Jesus is saying here in Matthew 5 is listen. I understand you have these intentions to focus on character, but you've kind of got it backwards. Because this isn't really about you. And the extent to which you benefit from it, like that's how life works. When other people benefit, then that's where you find your joy. It seems like he's going, no. Think of it in these opposite terms. It's the gift you give to others. Here's another way to think of it. Last February, I dealt with some of the worst anxiety I think I've ever dealt with. I think they were the most paralyzing panic attacks I've ever had, which isn't all that dignified. But it had to do with one of my boys and I were going to fly from here to Portland, and then he was going to go to class with me, which was kind of fun. And then we were going to fly across the country to South Florida, where we were going to stay with a couple I'd never met and go to spring training down around the Miami area and do some other stuff that he wanted to do down there. And I think my anxiety is around this idea of agoraphobia, which, as I'm understanding it, is just this fear of getting trapped places, and so you overestimate the risk and underestimate your ability to cope. It's all very silly when you say it out loud, but real when you're experiencing it. And I was very much in my head about what if this happens, and what if this happens, and what if this happens, and just doing the thing that weirdos like me do in those moments. And then there was this point, and my wife was not at all trying to be shaming, but there was this point where she's just like, what about him? Like, he gets to go on this adventure. He gets to sit in class, which frankly I think is a good experience, to go experience a different kind of a classroom and see that the college experience is different than what we experience in high school. He gets to be on this adventure. And she just kind of, there was lots of he's, and there was like, look at the pictures on the wall. You've been on these other trips with the other boys. Like, and for me, what snapped in all of that was this like, whoa. It doesn't mean it suddenly became comfortable, but this like, this isn't about me. And I think on this moral scale, maybe you picked up on it before I even connected those dots, there is this sense of like, wait a minute. We don't just do things so that we can be good. We do things so that we can show up in people's lives the way God would if he was us. Remember that, in my opinion, the gospel is not God does not like you, but found a way to trick himself to like you by dying on the cross. The gospel is God is wild about you. He doesn't just love you, he likes you. There's a real problem, sin and evil, and I can't fully understand all the complexities of why he had to deal with that the way he did, but I trust that he did. But the gospel is God likes you and, I think more than anything, wants to be with you. And here's the absurd thing, what Dallas Willard would call the divine conspiracy. The divine conspiracy is the way God shows up in people's lives, his master plan is you. God with us, we celebrate on Christmas, is the primary mechanism for that. Isn't angels, and it's not this other stuff, it's people indwelt by his Spirit. That the worldview is God wants to transform you so that you show up in people's lives, and in doing, they experience him. What if Jesus calls us to build our moral character in community, with community, and for community? Here's the other picture, and this is maybe a little juvenile, but for me it's been helpful. Justin's had us reading a book that uses domino illustrations, and so I think that's where this comes from. But I think the way I've always thought about morality is very individualistic. Like, if I'm generous, then God will bless me. If I'm a jerk, then I'll lose relationship. It's very, well, just individualistic. But you know because of who you work with and who you live with and who your friends are. Like, it actually doesn't work like that. I mean, to me, and I think we're going to do some church history stuff in the fall, because I have this newfound fascination with the fact that, wait a minute, we're a part of this giant, historic, dysfunctional, imperfect family. And oftentimes we're very willing to leave because of the bad, but we miss, like, wait a minute. Like, people hanging out with our kids on Wednesday night who have jobs of their own, like, that's a part of a moral domino effect that is beyond all of us. You've got family of origin issues and other church experience issues that all lead to this. See, in other words, I guess my point would be, this isn't all negative. Jesus isn't just saying, like, hey, things like adultery, they have long-lasting family effects, and they do. But it also means that so does generosity, and so does kindness. And even Paul says, hey, the fruits of the Spirit are love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and self-control. I've always seen that as this like individualistic promise. But every one of those attributes is an asset to a community. So here would be my final thought. If you're struggling to name yours, maybe it's as simple as, so how do you hurt people? How do you let people down? What's the chief moral issue that impacts your ability to be Emmanuel to people? And if you're someone like me who's pretty comfortable with yours, maybe you do well to go, okay, but if you're just thinking about it in terms of how it affects you, you're probably not there yet. And if you're just starting your journey of faith, boy, let us know if we can help you. But please know, the historic Jesus movement is a movement that says God likes people, loves them, died for them to solve some problems they couldn't solve on their own, but the story's never changed. A God who wants to be with us. But the us is a people. It's not just an individual. Let me pray. God, thanks for the way that you show up to us, Lord, and the way you show up through our relationships. And God, we're just trusting that you would lead us that way. For people here who are craving more relationship, that you'd help them see the steps to get that. For people here that are craving more of you, that they would see that relationship is how you get there too. Thanks, God, that you love us despite our stuff, and that you give us a long time to build our character. We love you. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.